Good evening. Well, I was very thrilled to be asked to be here this evening and speak to you about autism services in a school district. I am a director of student services and special education, and special education tends to take probably 85% of my time. But what I will start off with telling you is what I am not. And first of all, for the parents out there, I am not your enemy. I know that may be posted on a bathroom somewhere, but the special education administrator is not your enemy. And I also will tell you, I am not an expert in autism. And most special education administrators are not experts in autism. What they need to be experts in is utilizing their resident experts in autism, utilizing their community resources that are experts in autism, and being able to pull those together. And also as a special education administrator, my role and my duty is to ensure that the IEP process and the IEP implementation is happening for you, and for the student, and for the staff, and that the resources are there that are needed. And what I'd like to start off with is actually I give a handout that had a vocabulary thing on the front, Special Education / Autism Vocabulary 101. And the biggest thing special education administrators do is use a lot of vocabulary that is way above everybody's head in the room. So these are kind of some of the vocabulary words that I found. I'm talking in an IEP and the parent would say, "Whoa, stop. What do you mean by FAPE? Whoa, stop. What do you mean by certificated personnel? Who's that?" So I just pulled together some vocabulary that I'll refer to as I talk for my 5 minutes. When you come to a school district, you can come in a variety of ways. So assessment can start off in a variety of ways. A child could be identified in the Early Start program, and that's a transition assessment into the school district, and you're 3 years old. It may be that the child is a preschooler and it has a first school experience, and you go to your school district and say, something's not right here, and so that's a different kind of assessment, or a different kind of start to the assessment. You're initiating that, because we don't necessarily have a lot of preschools. Or you're a child in the school district, in the school system, and both you and the teacher are discussing why the child's not progressing or why the child's having issues on the playground, and that starts off an assessment. However you get there, the assessment is the same thing. You follow a procedure, there is a timeline, there are certain assessments we're going to do. Many times, children are identified outside the school district assessment process, and to piggyback on Dr. Graff, I actually in my handout included the DSM diagnosis opposite of the school district or the state criteria. And you can see just in looking at the print or at the 2 pages, the DSM diagnosis is full, very detailed. The special education diagnosis is 8 lines. So it is a very different diagnosis. So when a parent comes to a school district and says, I got this medical diagnosis of autism, we're not going to argue eligibility or diagnosis. This is a pretty detailed diagnosis. We say, okay, there's a diagnosis of autism. What we're going to look for in our assessment is what are the educational needs of that child with autism. So the assessment at that point could be looking at what does this child need? Are there speech and language needs? Are there occupational therapy needs? Not so much, is the child autistic or not? However, there are sometimes when we do assessments that we are looking, is the child autistic or not? And sometimes a child starts out with one eligibility in special education and they are very young, and as the child develops and becomes more involved in the school system, the eligibility can change as we see different needs. The IEP process and the role of the special education administrator is to make sure that the IEP process is followed. And the biggest thing of the IEP process is that it's a team process. It's not a school district telling you this is what happens, and it's not the parent telling the school district this is what happens, or an outside person telling everybody this is what happens. The IEP process is a team process, and that's really the special education administrator's job, is to make sure that we're working as a team, that we have the logistical pieces in place to have a team, that we're not having meetings, 2 people over here, 1 person over here, that we're coming together as a team and we're really agreeing as a team. If you think of the whole IEP process as kind of a cycle, you start off with your assessment, you determine your eligibility, you go to your goals and accommodations, which leads to, okay, in order to support these goals and accommodations, here's the services, and then you go to implementation. But that does need to be reviewed yearly to make sure that it's working and everything's going. So it is a cycle where you're constantly coming back to checking everything. Are we still eligible for special education? Are these still the pertinent goals? Are these still the pertinent accommodations? And therefore, are these still the pertinent services? So it's not something that gets written when a child's 6 years old and that's how it is for the rest of their life. It's something that's an ongoing, fluid process. In looking at school options, if you go to my vocabulary list, the first word on there is continuum. And you're going to hear people refer to that with the diagnosis of autism. It's a continuum. And we have a continuum of service options. So if you think of a continuum as starting with the least or the smallest or the mildest on one end, going all the way up to the biggest, the most severe, the strongest on the other end, school options should be the same way. And what I want to make clear is it's not a menu. We don't pick and choose from there what we want. It really needs to match with what the child's needs are. So if a child is a mild Asperger's like autistic child, then we're not going to necessarily say that that child needs a special day class unless those needs are exhibited. More likely they're going to need less intensive supports. And our job is to make sure that we have that continuum of options. Now in Ventura County, we're very lucky to have a wonderful SELPA organization. Special education is a little bit different from the rest of the educational world in the fact that most of education operates under a district umbrella, which I am a district employee of Pleasant Valley School District. However, I also operate under the SELPA umbrella. The SELPA has made guidelines and policies and rules that we all had to come together as a SELPA to agree on and then therefore implement. So I operate under both, and I try to make sure that our district's policies and guidelines are matching the SELPA's policies and guidelines. Therefore, that helps us have a very much wider range of continuum options than if I was just operating as a district. So obviously our continuum of options are going to start off with your least restrictive environment, which is the general education classroom. And one thing I want to say is that every child, when they're born, has a seat in a general education classroom. It's only after you've done assessment and determined goals and needs, and then you determine that that placement wouldn't necessarily be the placement, and you move up the continuum, ranging from general education with pull-out support, to special day class, to perhaps a county program, perhaps to even more restrictive, such as a non-public school. So I did that like in 3 minutes or less. So I'll gladly answer any questions you have at the end too.